Hello and welcome to episode number 326. This is the Project Management Podcast at pm-podcast.com and I'm Cornelius Fichtner. Thank you for listening in. Do you have a project management question? Then Jeff Furman very likely has the answer for you in the second edition of the Project Management Answer Book. The book includes questions like, why do project managers need a formal project charter? What is the role of a project manager? What are the top 10 pitfalls to avoid when starting a project? Or what is the single best way to prevent scope creep? And all answers are detailed, easy to understand, and often come with tips and tricks and tables and graphics and everything you need to fully understand and implement good practices on your own projects. And if your question is, where can I earn 37 PDUs quickly and for less than $5 per PDU, then, well, the answer is not in this book, but it comes instead with our sister podcast, the Agile Prepcast. It not only prepares you for your PMI ACP exam, but it also qualifies for a ton of PMP PDUs. Visit agileprepcast.com/PDU for the details. But now back to the book. This second edition is not just a rehash of what Jeff originally published some years back. Far from it. Jeff revisited every single question and wrote an updated answer to include changes in our industry. So it's not surprising that he now also includes sections on Agile, Scrum, and Stakeholder Management. Finally, before we get going with the interview, we are of course giving away 2 copies of the book on our Facebook page at facebook.com/pmpodcast. I'll give you all the details in the closing remarks after the interview is over. And now, my question for you is this. Will you please enjoy the interview?
The Project Management Podcast's feature interview. Today with Jeff Furman, author of the Project Management Answer Book and PMP instructor.
Hello, Jeff. Welcome back again.
Hi again, Cornelius. How are you?
I am doing very well, thank you. And I believe you must be doing well as well because your new book is out.
Yeah, it's very exciting and very fun to do a second edition.
Why did you choose to do a second edition? Was something wrong with the first edition?
Well, as you know, we have the PMBOK changes every few years.
Yes.
So that was the driver. But then also, I love learning new stuff all the time. I go to seminars everywhere in New York and at PMI NAC. So getting every new thing that I've learned in the last 3 years into the new book was very fun. And once you write a book, you have it in your head. I would like to still add this and add this, you know?
Mm-hmm. So let's take a look at the few areas of the book that are interesting. And for me personally, of course, I'm a PMP trainer. So for all those PMP candidates out there, what are some of the areas in the second edition which will especially help PMP candidates towards the exam?
Well, with the second edition, I really focused a lot more on the PMP exam. So it's a strong piece of the book more than the first was. And I got the idea to add 34 different test tips that were not in the first book. Some of them were new that I learned in my teaching over the last few years. So I put them in little boxes so they're easy to see. And there's 34 of them in little test tip boxes, kind of like little, call out boxes. So that was a very exciting thing to add. And they're all really very helpful. My students have constantly mentioned, boy, this one helped me a lot to pass my test.
Was there anything that was particularly fun about writing the second edition?
Well, yeah. When you get to do a second edition, it feels a little like Groundhog Day, the movie. You get to go back and make it perfect. So I actually told my editor I was in Groundhog Day heaven, which he thought was funny. But in other words, I took every single Q&A, I rewrote it to make it shorter and crisper, and also add more good new stuff to it, more examples, more best practices that I've picked up in my travels.
And what are some more of these great things that you added to the second edition?
Well, I added 3 new chapters, one to go with the new knowledge area, stakeholder management. So that was nice to add. So I'm really helping PMP candidates with that new area. Also, I did a new chapter all about integration management, but very heavily toward the test perspective. So integration is a tough chapter. It comes first in the PMBOK in the order, but it actually carries through the whole project. So people find that a tough one. You kind of have to study it first and last. So I wrote that chapter very much with how to help people toward the test with that chapter, and also my Scrum chapter we'll talk about. I also added, as I teach, I've taught about 250, believe it or not, project management classes, more than 100 PMP classes. So I've come up with some interactive exercises that my students have found really helpful, like they take it home and they do it, and it helps them toward the test. And I included those in my new second edition. So that was very nice that I was able to, I felt good about being able to get it in there. And it's like they're getting a big piece of my class from the book. I also added an appendix changes in the PMBOK Guide 5th edition, and not just a list, but very much how you can help. By reading this, it'll help you toward the test. Some people, as you know, they studied the PMP along the way, but they never took the test. So looking at it from a what changed perspective, nice and quick and concise, that will help them quite a bit. Also, I don't know if you found this to be true, but something that a lot of students find very baffling, there are a lot of PMP in the PMBOK, there are these processes where they mainly create a planning output that they're going to later use. So I call it planning the planning. Like, it's not the planning document, it's the how we're going to do it later planning document. So for instance, there's a lot of these documents and no one ever created them. And all of my students, they never heard of these documents usually. So they come into the class and they see that they're supposed to learn there's a scope management planning document and a risk management planning document. So all of these plans like those, I would say there's scope management plan, a risk management plan, quality management plan. Most students never heard of these before they come to the class, and that is hard for them. It's sort of unfamiliar. So I put together a grid. There are actually 13 of these outputs, and I made that nice and handy. Like, here's the output, here's the process that creates it, here's a brief description of that document. So that is a really pretty nice thing to summarize it, make it quick and easy, instead of a big bafflement that I've noticed that people see when they look at it in the PMBOK. Also, in the PMBOK, they're not really grouped in any way. They're just all over the PMBOK. So I put them in one place so everyone gets it right away. There's 13 of these. It's like one huge key fact.
Yes, personally, I've always thought that this whole planning is a bit overkill in the PMBOK guide. But then again, we have to understand that the PMBOK guide is actually rocket science. I mean, it was developed based on the 1960s, 70s project that NASA did. So we're talking about really huge projects where, planning the planning makes sense. Thinking about how you're going to be planning before you're actually doing the planning. But most of us these days, we don't have these humongous projects that require that much in-depth pre-planning. So yes, I've never done this either, but I do see the value once, you get to projects that are somewhat larger in size. However, there's one thing I want to clarify here. We've talked about the PMP exam in all 3 questions that I've asked you so far. You've mentioned it many times. And I think this is more because you're a PMP trainer, I'm a PMP trainer, a bit of what the French call déformation professionnelle. You just talk about this all the time. But your book is not a PMP exam prep book, right? It's a general project management answer book that answers questions, generic questions, but it can be used for PMP exam prep.
Yeah, the goal of the book was really to be a hands-on practitioner's guide, which is how I did it. But I also, because I teach a lot of PMP, I don't want anyone to not get enough for the PMP. So it's kind of a double value by design. If you're not going to go for the PMP, it's really still a very nice book for anyone in the field because it takes everything and puts it into all question and answer format, making it very quick and easy. Any topic you want. Here's the question, here's the answer. And it's not like the dummy books where it's very quick but not in detail. It's actually pretty detailed. So a lot of the Q&As are pretty advanced drill downs, like things like Six Sigma calculations and earned value calculations. So I actually have very good detail, but in quick Q&A format. And some of it is toward the PMP, but actually the majority is not toward the PMP. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, and to clarify it even more, let's completely leave the realm of the PMP and move into a totally different subject, because you've been teaching for the US Army. What are some of the things that you learned from the project managers at the Army that you were able to share with your readers in the second edition?
Yeah, it's very gratifying helping the Army, first of all, because it's a little bit of a giving back. And also, a lot of the soldiers, after 20 years, they're managing projects just like we are, except that there were bullets flying over their head. They're doing the same things like putting in networks, but it's in Afghanistan or in Iraq. So I find that the project managers in the Army have quite a lot to share. They're quite sharp. And every time I teach an Army class, I wind up with some takeaways that I can give to my future classes. Sometimes I'll use the Army terminology when I'm teaching at the Army because they can relate, okay, the Army uses this, which is a little like the PMI uses this. Some of the Army tips, though, are so good that I also use them back home in NYU when I'm teaching non-military people. It helps them broaden their knowledge area, and I think also toward the PMP, it helps them learn things better toward the test because they learn it in a broader way, with more real takeaways for on the job. I could actually give you examples if you wanted a couple.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Well, so for instance, we all know that lessons learned analysis is valuable. The Army does it better in a couple of ways. It's not just maybe we'll do lessons learned, but they literally require what they call AARs, which are after action reviews. So after a project or after a mission or after an activity, they have a formalized template that they work from where they literally do very heavy lessons learned to learn how to do everything better always next time. Also, the Army uses a method. You've heard of the challenge of how do you get your people to want to do lessons learned, and they also don't want to share negative things. They're afraid it looks bad. So the Army came up with the thing based on American baseball. They called it 3 up and 3 down. So this is a magic phrase. We know it from baseball, like 1 inning, but in lessons learned, it gives people the idea that they're going to talk about 3 up positive lessons learned, and then later 3 down ones, 3 negative things that maybe they can learn for. But just the phrase gets everyone in a pretty peppy mood where they see that it's okay to talk about the bad because we're going to start by talking about the good. Also, because it comes from baseball at 1 inning out of 9 innings, it reinforces the point that lessons learned aren't just at the end. It makes everyone kind of get it that lessons learned can help all the way along the way of a project. Another one is what we call scope creep. The Army calls mission creep. So, for instance, going into one activity that turns into a very long-term activity. But the Army people have a mindset that they know about mission creep. When I teach the Army, I talk about how scope creep is like that, but not the same exact thing. And then when I teach my people not in the military, it makes it interesting for them to hear that the Army calls something mission creep, like what we call scope creep. Also, the Army is really strong on procurement processes. They're maybe the world's expert on doing it. They have a great deal of experience. So relating it to the PMBOK, we use what's called the select sellers list. The Army and all of the federal government, they have to go by a select sellers list. It's not maybe, it's a requirement. A lot of the American federal government uses the list called the GSA schedule. But one of my colonels at one of the Army classes, he told me that they have the opposite of that. They call it a debarred list. I don't know if you ever heard of that. But
I have not.
So that was an interesting thing. They have a list, you could call it the bad list. They take the time to document which vendors do we not want our team working with in the future. And here's the list, and here's why, and here was the incident. So that's pretty good. It's tying lessons learned together, but it's taking it further than just a select sellers list. And I find that, the more a good student hears about a select sellers list, but they also hear about a debarred list. So it reinforces both at the same time. Both concepts kind of go together, and they really learn the select sellers list concept, but they pick up a new best practice at the same time. Like it's very quick to teach two related things at once. I find when I can go out and gather those. Another thing is we learn about sole source versus single source procurement in the PMBOK. The Army takes that further, and actually to discourage sole source procurement, if you're going to do a purchase that's sole source, you have to fill out literally a sole source justification form. So that is pretty good as a best practice. It's sort of a very big check and balance before someone runs out and just buys from their brother-in-law's company. They have to actually go through hoops, but I would say that's a good thing. And also as a trainer, this reminds people of why is a sole source worth thinking about. Another thing that I learned from the Army, they don't just use the SOW statement of work, they also use what's called a PWS, performance work statement. And so instead of having the statement of work could be in all different kinds of flavors, maybe you've seen that people have all different ways of doing an SOW.
Oh, yeah, everybody does it their own way.
So in the Army, to take away any confusion, they have the SOW is more sort of straightforward, just the facts, but they sometimes use the performance work statement when they want to invite creativity and really see specifically what unique solutions the vendor might bring to the table. So instead of making the SOW the all-in-one catch-all, when they use both, they have that differentiation, and that makes their process better. So this is the Army. Some of the Army construction engineers use this PWS SOW combination.
All right. Let's move on to the next topic, and that is Agile and Scrum, because your first edition, that was all waterfall. And of course, you have decided to put Agile and Scrum into the book. A couple of large chapters, actually, right?
Yes, there's such a big explosion of people that want to know about Scrum nowadays. And again, being in New York, it's kind of a real capital for Scrum. There is a lot going on. So many IT shops in New York City are based there, and they use Scrum, and it's helping other groups, not IT people, also gravitate to Scrum. So I think it's one of my best chapters. It was very enjoyable to write this big Scrum chapter, and it was quite fun to do. I find that when I teach even a waterfall class, even a PMP class, people want to know a little bit about Scrum. And when I teach different kinds of project management classes, like a general class, Scrum, Agile is a lot of what people want to know about. So I like to sprinkle in some Scrum training. Another funny way to look at it is you might think of this when someone goes on a job interview nowadays, no one is tying the hands of the interviewer that it's going to be all waterfall all the time. They can ask anything they want. And when they ask an applicant, well, tell me what you know about Agile or Scrum in particular, they have a few ulterior motives. I think they want to see, what does this guy know about Scrum? Partly it shows, are they a good learner? Do they like learning new things? Or is the guy going to be, I'm just a waterfall guy. That's my resume. That's me. That's it. So learning Scrum, even for a waterfall person, is really valuable. Everyone likes learning it. And on top of that, as soon as they see what it's about, they immediately love it anyway. As soon as they see the different format, and they like seeing the sprints, and they like a lot about Scrum the minute they see it, and they immediately see benefits over waterfall. So it was actually very exciting to do this chapter. I got to meet people like Ken Schwaber, some of the founders of the Agile Manifesto. They lectured in New York. Particularly, there's a great group called NYC Scrum, where they have free meetings once a month, and also Agile NYC. So I learn a lot by going to these meetings, and I get to meet a lot of the really leading edge people in the Scrum field. So I could put all of that good stuff in my book. Every key term that I've heard in Scrum, I have a pretty good definition and examples in my book, and lots of stuff about the Agile Manifesto and all that, which has nothing to do with waterfall, of course.
You also came across a lot of new terms and new acronyms that you included in the book, and we're going to focus on these in the next few minutes here. We're starting out with the Human Resources Management chapter, where you have something that's called the Spitter Syndrome.
Yes, this is a very destructive kind of behavior, and I've noticed it so many times that it dawned on me that it's worth sharing in the book as something not to do. It stands for smartest person in the room syndrome. Maybe you have encountered this, and if you have, you've probably seen how there's a guy in the room typically that will pull rank on everyone else or act like he's the only one worth listening to, and he'll shut down other people. So it's a very destructive behavior. Even if someone is the most knowledgeable in the room, it's not a good way to run a meeting like only I am the one who knows everything. So it actually literally shuts down other people and causes kind of a bad vibe in the meeting, you could say. So I call that spitter syndrome, and it's something to be on the lookout for. And it's something that if you're leading the meeting, it behooves you to try to watch out for that in yourself or in others. And the goal is to have a really productive meeting, not to give anyone a venue to dominate the meeting.
Next, what is the red ink mentality?
Well, this is a phrase that I thought of for a phenomenon that I have personally seen. If you ever have had the pleasure of being in a corporate merger, which is usually not a pleasure, both sides think that they're the ones that will hopefully win in the end. So instead of going for a synergy, it's more like a heavyweight knockout fight usually. And Company A and Company B, they both think that they're the only ones who will be left standing. So they treat the others on purpose as red ink. They act like, well, we're the ones that are still going to be here after the dust settles of this merger, and you guys are all going to be gone anyway. They don't say it, but they think it, and they act that way if no one makes them act better. So that's another thing where if you want to be a good senior leader, you can be on guard for this. The merger that I was part of, I would say, was not done overly well. And one lesson learned is they should have seen this behavior and jumped on it. Plenty of people were there for many years through the merger, so nobody got their wish that it would only be them and everyone else would be gone. So it's kind of bullying behavior and should be stopped by senior management.
Okay, so spitter syndrome and the red ink mentality, both new terms in human resources. The other area that we have here is the SWOT analysis, where you have something new, a few related acronyms to SWOT: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, that I have never heard of. What are they? Pest, slept, and pestle?
Yeah, so you live and learn. When you first learn SWOT, you think that's pretty awesome, and I never heard of that at first. But now, doing a lot of research and teaching thousands of students, I'm always learning new things as I get around. So there are three more variations. It's sort of the idea of SWOT, but it's taking it further by looking at more risk categories. So PEST stands for political, economic, social, and technology. And when you look at them, you realize, wow, it is a pretty good idea not only to take into account certain key risk areas, but also, are you thinking about political ramifications on your project, especially in the government? If you're doing a government project or especially an army project, what are political ramifications of this action or this deliverable that we're working on? Or could there be economic ramifications, like, you build a new machine and suddenly you're replacing people? You might be making it more efficient, but are you lowering quality? Are you losing customers because they prefer human interaction? An example of that is, so many call centers went to follow a script instead of to really listen to the person. And customers generally don't like that. They don't care that it's saving the company money. They care that when they call for tech support, they get really good tech support. So sometimes part of a project can have economic ramifications one way or another. That's just one example. Social ramifications. If we make a certain change, or will our project somehow have social ramifications on other parts of society? Also technology. So when we're doing our project, what are specific technological angles to think about? What are specific risk categories related to these four? And then as soon as someone came along with pest, other parts of the world, the PMI organization is worldwide, and there's always a new, better mousetrap. So someone took that and they added legal to the list. So adding the L for legal, they came out with SLEPT, and then also PESTLE. PESTLE adds environmental. So all of these acronyms are for additional areas to focus on when doing risk analysis, not just to go with the classic parameters, but to think about what are other key areas that we don't want to neglect at our peril.
All right, and we have two more new terms here, and we're staying in risk management with these. So what are these two? And I don't even know if I can pronounce the first one here. So what is risk incidentalomas? What are incidentalomas?
Well, it's a pretty hard word to say, and it's a pretty good one. In fact, it's not in the dictionary, but it is in the world. So I found this originally in a newspaper article recently by a medical doctor. In medicine, an incidentaloma is you go to the doctor to get, let's say, a chest x-ray to make sure you don't have tuberculosis before you start a job. It's kind of routine. Well, they take the x-ray, you don't have tuberculosis, but what if they discover a tumor? And if they discover it early, the good news is they catch a tumor they wouldn't have caught. So this is pretty good. And so relating that to project management, how many times have maybe you're working on a bug fix, and working on that fix leads you to find another bug, and maybe the new bug is much more important or critical than the original bug. Or working on a bug fix, you accidentally stumble on a new feature or an enhancement. So I call it risk incidentalomas, things that you can look for, not to just over focus on the one risk, but to be broad-minded and to look for things that could be related risks or related positive risks, opportunities that the negative risk might lead you to discover.
All right. And then we also have the airport shoe syndrome. And let me just guess, this has to have something to do with the fact when you fly here in the United States and you go through the security check, you have to take off your shoes so that they can scan your shoe, x-ray your shoes to make sure that it doesn't have a bomb inside of it. Please tell me it has something to do with that.
Yes, it does. But I have actually thought of this long before the shoe bomber. Working in IT project management for many years, I have often noticed that people tend to go overboard. Once a risk is discovered and documented, people tend to put it in a list for next time, and then they'll always do a whole bunch of work on just that one risk. And they probably over-focus on that one risk at the peril of looking at other risks. So for instance, we had the shoe bomber. His bomb didn't go off, fortunately, but from this one shoe bomber, every time anyone flies a plane, they have to take off their shoes, put them up on the thing, worry about them, stand on their feet uncomfortably. So are we going overboard analyzing shoes and neglecting lots of other risk areas? There are all kinds of threats we always have another incident where it's a new kind of risk unrelated to shoes, right? So we just had the case where they were trying to make sure that they could lock terrorists out of the cockpit. So they locked it so well that the pilot couldn't get back in the recent incident. And they didn't think maybe they should give the key to both the pilot and the co-pilot. So really just to avoid exactly this. So I think we've probably gone overboard with worrying about shoes at the expense of worrying about other issues. And the airport shoe syndrome is a way to keep that in mind. We all do that a million times now, but are we all done worrying about threats, and are we neglecting threats that we should not be?
And you know what? This actually takes me back a few years. I did an interview with Mark Mullally, and they did a study on, I think it was the value of project management. It was a PMI-sponsored study. One thing they found is that over time, PMOs tend to have more and more and more complex methodologies. And exactly because of this shoe syndrome. You do lessons learned, you learn something, and you say, okay, this went really well on our project. All future projects have to include this.
Yeah.
Or here's a threat that we had on this project. So all future projects have to work on this and make sure that threat doesn't affect them. So you add more and more and more red tape into your PMO handbooks, into your methodologies, that after a few years, your methodologies become so overblown and so big that they're unwieldy, and you really have to go in with a machete and you have to start weeding out, and you have to get back to the basics and go, you know what, this issue here is only for 0.0001% of the cases. It's really not important to leave that in here. I like it. Airport shoe syndrome. Very nice, very nice. Okay, in closing, what would you consider to be the top 2 maybe questions and answers from your book that our listeners here should know about and understand as a takeaway for them?
Well, it's always fun when you hear a really good new thing. So only recently I saw a video of Mark Langley, the CEO of PMI. We all know the classic triple constraint, and I have a few versions of the triple constraint in my book. I actually have 6 different ones that I've discovered that are all pretty good. And he came out with what he calls the new project management triangle. So this is from Mark Langley, and it's called the talent management triple constraint or triangle. I have a picture of the triangle in my book, and he says that, of course, we do still need to care about scope, time, and cost, the classic triple constraint. But nowadays, to be an effective project manager and a leader, you have to care about your talent. So focusing on your talent of your team members, he has technical expertise, leadership expertise, and strategic management expertise. So these are 3 areas, 3 lines on a triangle. And like the classic triple constraint, they're all important. They all influence the other 2. Each one influences the other 2. And you want to have, a careful look at all 3 to keep in mind as you're leading your team. So you can be, again, more of a leader and not just a manager by following Mark Langley's triple constraint. So that's one that I like a lot. I added that into my HR chapter. I call it What's the New Talent Management Triple Constraint. And another, since stakeholder management is a new knowledge area, it was fun to really dig into that and think about, why did PMI, after all these years, see the need for adding the 10th knowledge area? And the name of it, stakeholder management, that's pretty important. You might have thought it was covered already in the first 9, but really there's some very good stuff that was added to this new knowledge area called stakeholder management. And I have actually 2 related Q&As for 2 of the new documents. So to help manage your stakeholders and strategize on how to keep your stakeholders happy towards successful projects, there are 2 new documents in the PMBOK that were added. One is the power and interest grid, and the other is the stakeholder engagement assessment matrix. So I have both of these as separate Q&As in my book, like what is this grid and how does it help you manage your stakeholders and keep them happy. And so I have one for each, and I include a diagram of each and an explanation with examples of each.
All right, once again, the book is called The Project Management Answer Book, 2nd edition. It is, of course, written by none other than Jeff Furman. It has 488 pages, and it is published by Management Concepts Press. Jeff, thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thank you again, Cornelius. I hope to see you at the next PMI NAC.
And that was our interview with Jeff Furman on the Project Management Answer Book, 2nd edition. And as promised at the start, we are giving away 2 copies of the book to you, our listeners. If you have a paid premium subscription to our premium podcast, then you don't have to do anything. You are automatically entered into the giveaway. Everyone else, please go to facebook.com/pmpodcast. Look for the book giveaway announcement and simply follow the instructions. We will close the Facebook giveaway about 3 weeks after we first publish the interview that you just heard. And once again, if your question is, where can I earn 37 PDUs quickly and for less than $5 per PDU? Then it's not in the book, it's with the Agile Prepcast. So please go to agileprepcast.com/PDU for the details. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening. As always, you can find us on the web at pm-podcast.com. Please send your emails to info@pm-podcast.com. And when you write, please do tell me where in the world you are writing from. And finally, we have another popular saying that we twisted a bit. The saying is, discretion is the better part of valor. And again, with a bit of project management cynicism, this becomes, discretion is the better part of a status report. Until next time.